The paper refuses to cooperate at first. Cheap, government-issue writing material, rough and brittle, nothing like the delicate washi that Fumiko Sato learned to fold when her grandmother's patient hands guided her small fingers through the precise geometry that transforms flat surfaces into three-dimensional prayers. But desperation breeds innovation, and after 18 months in the Granada War Relocation Center, Fumiko has learned to make magic from whatever materials the camp commissary provides. She dampens the paper slightly with breath that steams in the Colorado cold, softening the fibers just enough to accept the complex series of mountain and valley folds that will coax a crane into existence from ordinary bureaucratic stationery. Across the fence that separates the camp from the Ute Indian Reservation, 7 children watch with the absolute attention that children bring to processes they cannot yet understand, but recognize as important. They have been observing the Japanese woman for 3 days, drawn by the careful precision of her movements, the way she treats each piece of paper like something precious rather than disposable, the mysterious transformation that happens when her fingers find exactly the right sequence of creases and curves and patient pressure. To 8-year-old Joseph Birch, whose Ute grandmother tells stories about animals that change shape and spirits that wear different forms depending on who needs to see them, this looks like the most powerful magic he has ever witnessed happening in daylight. The crane emerges gradually, then suddenly, the way that understanding often develops when complex systems reach the threshold where individual elements become something larger than their separate components. One moment, Fumiko holds a square of institutional paper, marked with regulations about mail censorship and visiting restrictions. The next moment, a bird perches in her palm, complete with wings that flutter when she breathes on them, a neck that curves with elegant proportion, a tail that suggests flight, even though this particular crane will never leave the ground. She sets it carefully on the windowsill, where the afternoon sun illuminates the careful geometry that has transformed waste material into wonder, where the Ute children can see proof that creation is possible even in places designed to eliminate the human capacity for making beauty from limitation. This is not the story of cultural exchange across ethnic boundaries. This is the story of recognition, the moment when children who understand transformation through their own storytelling traditions witness transformation through an entirely different cultural technology, and recognize that both traditions serve the same essential human need to believe that change is possible, that beauty can emerge from constraint, that dignity survives even when everything else has been taken away. Colorado in 1944 carries the accumulated weight of multiple displacements, overlapping removals, the geographical evidence of what happens when federal policies treat diverse human communities like problems requiring standardized solutions. The Granada War Relocation Center, officially designated Amache, spreads across high desert landscape that was never intended to support the agricultural activities that 10,000 Japanese Americans attempt to establish behind barbed wire and armed guards. The soil resists cultivation. The climate challenges people raised in coastal California's moderate temperatures and predictable growing seasons. Everything about the physical environment seems designed to demonstrate that this is temporary space, punishment disguised as protection, containment rationalized as national security necessity. 20 miles east, the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation occupies land that was never intended to support the kind of economic development that federal Indian policy promotes as the solution to the Indian problem. Mineral rights have been leased to outside corporations. Grazing permits favor non-Indian ranchers who can afford the legal complexity that surrounds tribal land use. Educational opportunities require Ute children to attend boarding schools designed to eliminate their cultural identity through systematic separation from family, language, traditional knowledge systems that have sustained their people through centuries of adaptation and survival under increasingly difficult circumstances. Both communities understand displacement. Both have experience with government promises that change faster than the policies designed to implement them. Both know the particular challenge of raising children who must learn to navigate dominant institutions while maintaining connection to cultural resources that those institutions consider irrelevant at best, problematic at worst. What they do not understand is each other. Federal policies work to maintain separation between different populations under governmental supervision, to prevent the kind of mutual recognition that might complicate simple narratives about American democracy's capacity to manage diversity through appropriate institutional channels. But children follow their own logic. Curiosity crosses boundaries that fear establishes. Wonder transcends the artificial separations that politics creates between peoples who share more fundamental experiences than governments want them to recognize. When Ute children discover that the Japanese woman behind the fence can transform ordinary paper into extraordinary creatures, they respond not with the suspicion that their parents have learned to maintain toward strangers, but with the fascination that children naturally feel when they encounter evidence that the world contains more possibilities than adult explanations typically acknowledge. Fumiko had learned origami from her grandmother, Oba-chan, who had learned from her grandmother, who had learned from Buddhist monks, who understood that folding paper required the same attention to detail, the same patience with process, the same willingness to trust in outcome without controlling method that characterized the most advanced forms of spiritual practice. Every crane represented a prayer for longevity, for peace, for the kind of transformation that allows humans to transcend the circumstances that seem to limit their possibilities. Every fold required faith that the next step would become clear when the current step was completed with appropriate attention and respect for the materials being transformed. In the camp, origami became more than childhood memory or cultural preservation. It became practical magic, a way of creating beauty from the limited materials that institutional life provided, a form of meditation that required no special equipment or official permission, a bridge between the world she had lost and the world she was learning to inhabit. The paper cranes accumulated on her windowsill like evidence that dignity could be maintained through daily practice of skills that connected her to sources of strength that displacement was designed to eliminate. Each bird represented resistance disguised as compliance, hope disguised as harmless craft activity, cultural preservation disguised as personal hobby. The Ute children understood none of this complexity. They saw only transformation, the kind of change that their own storytelling traditions celebrated in tales of Coyote, who could become anything he needed to become, of animals who wore human form when circumstances required it, of spirits who manifested in whatever shape would help the people understand important lessons about survival and adaptation and the possibility of maintaining dignity despite circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate it. When the Japanese woman folded paper into birds, she demonstrated the same essential power that their grandparents described in traditional stories about transformation, change, the fluidity of form that allows life to persist even when external conditions seem impossible. The first direct contact happens accidentally. Joseph Birch's younger sister slips through a gap in the fence that their parents have repeatedly warned them to avoid. Drawn by curiosity stronger than caution, by the child's natural assumption that interesting adults want to share their interesting activities with interested children. Fumiko discovers the 6-year-old standing beside her barracks window, pointing at the paper cranes with the mixture of wonder and expectation that children bring to encounters with magic they assume is intended for their benefit. The language barrier dissolves in the face of shared fascination with process rather than product, with method rather than outcome. Fumiko shows Sarah how to hold the paper, how to make the first diagonal fold that establishes the foundation for everything that follows. Sarah's small fingers lack the precision that years of practice have given Fumiko, but her attention is absolute, her willingness to attempt complex procedures without fear of failure complete. Together they work through the sequence of steps that transforms flat surface into three-dimensional possibility. Fumiko demonstrating while Sarah copies, both discovering that teaching and learning create their own form of communication that transcends the limitations of shared vocabulary. The other children arrive gradually, drawn by the rare sound of laughter from behind the fence, by their sister's obvious engagement with an activity that appears to be both challenging and rewarding. Soon, 7 Ute children sit cross-legged on the camp side of the boundary line, each working with their own square of precious paper, each attempting to replicate the magic that transforms ordinary materials into extraordinary creatures. Their failures are spectacular and hilarious. Their successes are modest, but genuine. Their concentration is complete and beautiful, and exactly what Fumiko remembers from her own childhood lessons with Oba-chan, who understood that learning traditional arts required patience with process, faith in eventual mastery, willingness to find joy in approximation while working toward precision. The origami lessons become regular, then anticipated, then essential to the rhythm of afternoon activities that help both teacher and students navigate the psychological landscape of displacement and uncertainty that characterizes their respective situations. Fumiko discovers that teaching connects her to the cultural knowledge that camp life tends to isolate and privatize, that sharing traditional skills creates community across boundaries that politics has established between peoples who were never meant to recognize their fundamental similarities. The children learn not only how to fold paper, but how to see possibility in limitation, how to find beauty in constraint, how to maintain focus when external circumstances demand constant adaptation to conditions beyond their control. Word of the origami circle spreads through both communities with the mixture of curiosity and concern that cultural mixing typically generates when it occurs without official supervision or approval. Some Ute parents worry that their children's fascination with Japanese arts might complicate their already precarious relationship with federal authorities who monitor tribal activities for signs of political unreliability or cultural resistance that might require intervention. Some Japanese families in the camp express concern that drawing attention from local populations might lead to restrictions on activities that currently exist in the informal spaces between official regulation and community self-determination. But the children's obvious happiness provides its own justification. Sarah Birch carries her first successful crane home like treasure, explaining to her grandmother in rapid Ute the process by which flat paper becomes flying bird, demonstrating the folds she has learned with the pride that children feel when they master techniques that adults have not taught them. Her grandmother, Elena Birch, recognizes something familiar in her granddaughter's description of the Japanese woman's patient teaching method, the way that traditional knowledge passes between generations through careful demonstration and respectful imitation, the way that craft skills carry cultural values embedded in technique itself. Among the Japanese families, Fumiko's informal teaching becomes evidence that cultural preservation can find expression through activities that appear harmless to administrative oversight while serving essential functions of community maintenance and identity preservation. The origami lessons demonstrate that traditional knowledge remains alive and available for transmission across cultural boundaries, that displacement need not result in complete cultural isolation, that teaching traditional arts creates connections that transcend the artificial separations that politics has established between different populations under federal supervision. The moment of adult recognition arrives when Elena Birch walks to the fence line to retrieve her grandson, who has spent the afternoon learning to fold paper horses, and encounters Fumiko, creating a complex dragon that requires techniques far beyond anything the children have attempted. The two grandmothers regard each other across the boundary line with the particular attention that traditional women bring to encounters with other traditional women, each recognizing in the other the carriage of someone who carries cultural knowledge, who understands the responsibility of transmission, who knows that some forms of teaching cannot be delegated to institutions or postponed until more convenient circumstances make them easier to accomplish. Elena speaks first, not in English but in Ute, a formal greeting that acknowledges Fumiko's role as teacher, as holder of traditional knowledge, as someone who deserves respect for her willingness to share cultural resources with children who lack access to such resources through their own community's current circumstances. Fumiko responds with a bow, not the casual acknowledgement that Americans offer each other in passing, but the formal recognition of elder status, of traditional knowledge, of the particular dignity that belongs to grandmothers who understand their obligations to future generations. The conversation that follows happens mostly in gestures, in the shared language of women who recognize each other's commitment to cultural preservation despite the different forms that commitment takes in their respective traditions. Elena indicates her approval of the origami lessons, her gratitude for her grandchildren's obvious happiness, her recognition that Fumiko's teaching represents generosity that deserves reciprocal respect and support. Fumiko communicates her appreciation for the children's attention, their willingness to learn, their capacity to find joy in process, rather than demanding immediate mastery of complex techniques. The exchange establishes permission for the continued lessons, adult approval for cultural mixing that serves educational rather than political purposes, recognition that traditional arts create connections between peoples who share commitment to maintaining cultural knowledge despite circumstances that make such maintenance challenging. Elena begins bringing materials. Better paper when she can find it, colored pencils for decorating finished creatures, small gifts that acknowledge Fumiko's role as teacher without creating obligations that might complicate the informal nature of their arrangement. The lessons expand. Fumiko teaches not only basic animal forms, but more complex figures that require advanced techniques. Flowers that bloom when handled correctly, boxes that reveal hidden compartments, modular designs that require multiple pieces assembled according to precise geometric principles. The children's skill develops rapidly, their attention spans increase, their understanding of the relationship between patience and beauty deepens through daily practice of arts that reward persistence while demanding attention to detail that cannot be faked or rushed. But more than technique transfers between teacher and students, values embed themselves in method. The children learn that creating beauty requires respect for materials, that rushing produces inferior results, that genuine mastery develops through years of practice rather than hours of effort. They discover that traditional knowledge carries obligations, that learning creates responsibility to preserve and transmit what has been received, that cultural skills connect them to communities of practice that extend across time and geography to include all people who have ever folded paper with reverence and joy. The origami circle becomes a bridge between communities that federal policies were designed to keep separate, a demonstration that cultural exchange can occur without threatening the integrity of either tradition involved. Ute children learn Japanese arts without becoming less Ute. Fumiko maintains connection to traditional knowledge while discovering that teaching creates community that transcends ethnic boundaries. Both groups discover that creativity generates its own form of resistance to circumstances designed to limit human possibility, that beauty emerges from constraint when people possess the skills and patience required to transform limitation into opportunity. When winter arrives and outdoor lessons become impossible, Elena invites Fumiko to teach in the tribal community center. making the origami circle an official activity rather than an informal arrangement. The invitation represents significant recognition, acknowledgement that Japanese cultural arts deserve respect and preservation, that Fumiko's teaching serves educational purposes that benefit Yutei children, that cultural exchange can occur without compromising either community's commitment to maintaining their own traditional identities. The formal lessons attract adult attention, positive and negative. Some tribal members appreciate the opportunity for their children to learn skills that develop patience and attention to detail while creating beautiful objects from minimal materials. Others worry that Japanese influence might undermine efforts to revitalize Ute traditional arts that have been suppressed by federal educational policies designed to eliminate native cultural practices. Federal administrators observe the arrangement with suspicion, uncertain whether cultural mixing represents beneficial integration or potentially problematic collaboration that might complicate their management of both populations. But the children's obvious happiness and rapidly developing skills provide their own justification. The origami lessons produce tangible results, increased attention spans, improved manual dexterity, enhanced appreciation for traditional arts in general rather than Japanese arts specifically. Sarah Birch begins teaching her younger cousins the basic crane fold, demonstrating that learning creates the capacity for teaching, that cultural knowledge expands when it is shared rather than hoarded. Joseph discovers that the patience required for successful origami improves his performance in other traditional activities. Beadwork, hide preparation, the careful attention to detail that all traditional crafts require. The lessons continue through the war's end, through the camp's closure, through Fumiko's relocation to Denver, where she works in a commercial laundry while rebuilding the life that executive orders had interrupted. But the connection persists. Elena and her grandchildren send letters that include origami creations, evidence that the techniques have been preserved and are being transmitted to a new generation of Ute children, who understand that traditional knowledge can take many forms, that cultural preservation sometimes requires learning from unexpected teachers, that beauty creates bridges between peoples who were never meant to discover their fundamental similarities. Decades later, when Sarah Birch becomes a grandmother herself, she teaches her own grandchildren to fold paper cranes, explaining the techniques that a Japanese woman taught her during the war, describing the patient precision that transforms ordinary materials into extraordinary creatures. The lessons carry forward not only the specific skills of origami, but the deeper understanding that cultural knowledge belongs to anyone willing to learn with appropriate respect and attention, that traditional arts create community across boundaries that politics tries to maintain, that teaching generates the kind of human connection that survives displacement, war, and all the artificial divisions that fear uses to keep people separated from sources of strength and beauty that extend beyond individual communities. The paper birds fly through generations, carrying messages that transcend the specific circumstances of their creation. Each fold represents resistance to forces that would eliminate the human capacity for finding beauty in limitation, for creating community across cultural boundaries, for maintaining dignity through daily practice of skills that connect individual practitioners to traditions larger than their immediate circumstances. Each crane demonstrates that transformation is possible, of paper into bird, of stranger into teacher, of suspicion into friendship, of confinement into opportunity for unexpected connection. If stories like this remind you that magic happens when traditional knowledge crosses cultural boundaries, that children often understand connection better than adults understand separation, then perhaps there are other moments of unexpected teaching worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges require us to choose between the safety of cultural isolation and the transformative power of respectful learning across the artificial boundaries that keep us. from discovering how much we share.